All right. Well, good morning, St. John's. This is another special edition of Between Two Services. I'm joined this morning with Deacon Emily. I'm going to try not to swivel in my chair. I've been told that that is a distraction. Um, we are wrapping up our investigation in this virtual ministry setting. We're by no means, I think, done with the work as a congregation, but we're wrapping up our examination, our research into the connection between St. John's and slavery, the historic connections, and today I think Deacon and Emily and I want to share some reflections, some possible next steps for the congregation, and just one piece of follow up research that I've done to as part of the larger story of what we've been looking at. So yeah,
Glad to be here, and I think this is important work that we're doing and starting.
I do too, and I think starting is a really important word. Um, I think you and we've along with Ian, we're grateful for Ian. We're grateful for Mary Catherine. We've been helped along the way by some members of the parish, and I think we've gone in this part of the work. We've gone about as far as we can, but there are avenues and next steps. And so, like, my hope is someone will watch this and in the next, I don't know, 3, 6, 24, 36 months, um, prayerfully discern and say, maybe let's think about doing X. And I
Mhm.
don't know what the X is. Um,
Yeah, I think it's gonna take time. Um, I don't think people should necessarily wanna jump into something, but, certainly prayerfully, spiritually discern what would be helpful going forward and, where does the church need to go? What do we need to learn?
how can we build some relationships? Um, to me, as a pastor, I think the biggest avenue coming out of this for reflection, for further study, and I think for some very prayerful relationship building is what is the story of what happened to Woodford County after the Civil War? Because you have a county that goes from being 52% African American um, to being like 8 or 9%. And that's a massive demographic change. And we know that there have been migrations involving after slavery. We know that there have been migrations at various points in American history in response to racial injustice. But we're really talking about a county that had a similar portion of enslaved population as counties in the Deep South today that are still majority Black. And
Mhm.
it went from being majority African American to being very overwhelmingly white, which means that the outmigration here had to have been really significant. And the factors around that, I think, lead us to some examinations about like what is the legacy of racism and racial oppression in this county. And I think when we start learning these things, that invites us to start looking at what happened not just in the 1860s, but in the 1890s, the 1910s, the 1930s,
Certainly.
40s, the 50s, into the 60s, into today, because of course, like these experiences impact us. They carry along generationally, just like we know people whose families were here in Woodford County, uh, white families who were here in Woodford County historically. Then certainly there are also African American families that stayed and know this history, um, even if they may not feel comfortable sharing it broadly. Uh,
Right.
and um, and then there's all kinds of people who left who, um, yeah, it, you know, there's always two things that come to mind. I love this community. I love this congregation. Um, but I think it's easy sometimes as a white person to look at a charming small town America and just be like, oh, this place is really great and wholesome and good, and never go looking at deeper issues and whether or not it's been wholesome and good and welcoming to everybody, or
Right, right,
if it's been
right.
more wholesome, good, and welcoming to me than it might have been to other people.
Mhm.
Um, I think that examination is important for us.
I agree. Well, and I think, if we can have people maybe that are interested in looking back in newspaper clippings and kind of what was the feel of the town at different, points in history and, you know, what was being taught, what was being circulated would be really helpful to know.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good opportunity for anyone who's a genealogy buff to really help us. And maybe in the future do a deeper dive. I did a couple of cursory looks, using resources from ancestry.com, um, to try to figure out, okay, we have a list of names of people who are in our baptismal record that we believe were enslaved. Can we tell what happened to them? And I think,
Right.
you know that almost immediately gets very complicated because, like, did people keep the same names? Did they move? Were they in the
Right.
army?
Right.
Uh, and these skills, um it's like what Ian told us from the very beginning: be careful, double check, look at
Mhm.
references. um and so I think that's the point where people who have, I think, some good foundational library skills and some foundational genealogy skills could really help us, I think, flesh out some of these stories more than we're able to just clicking
Right.
on
Right.
websites. Um, with that said, I think that there are two things that we found out. One is, I'd asked Louise Jones to look for Sarah F. Gaines's will, and in the course of that examination, we found out um, that she didn't die when we thought that she did. We thought that she I thought that she had passed away based on that one notation in the record, um, that at around 1855, 1856. We actually found probate records, census records, and then actually a church burial record that shows that Sarah F. Gaines lived until 1867. And so that's post war, which means, while her will, which we still haven't been able to locate, would be interesting to a certain extent. Obviously, after the Civil War, she's probably not leaving her enslaved property to anyone.
Mhm.
So then that got me interested in really looking at the stories of the people, who we do have included on our baptismal record, and just to kind of remind everyone. Let me share the screen here real quick. We found a record in our baptismal record. They're actually the 14th through the 24th baptisms recorded in St. John's, and attached to their notation is the note attached to their baptismal record that the colored persons here recorded belong to the estate of Mrs. Sarah F. Gaines, a member of St. John's Church in Versailles. You can see why we thought belonged to the
Mhm.
estate. Um, Now, it's possible that this note was added later. Um, that would, I mean, I think you'd need someone who's better equipped. I don't know if this handwriting matches this handwriting perfectly. Uh,
Mm.
there's a lot of things, or they could have just been thinking about the estate. We tend to think of estate as, what's left um, after someone's dead. But if someone has a large estate, I mean, it is possible that it's a contemporaneous note that just reflects a different usage of English. I don't know,
Mhm.
but we have this list of names, and so here are the names that we have, and so there's a list of names up on your screen.
Mhm.
So Lydia Ann Johnson, Frank Johnson, Robert Crane, John Crane, Mary Catherine Johnson, Charles Johnson, William Johnson, Jacob Vance, George Vance, Emily Ann Vance. And I will say, I was able to find a number of hits on Ancestry.com for these names, including some birth records. Um, it's interesting that everyone listed here has a first and last name. Fairly that's fairly unique with these kinds of records. Um, it's also makes it challenging. For example, I mean, Johnson is not an uncommon last name, and so
Right.
sort of figuring out, are the subsequent records actually, do they actually connect with these particular people? This is where we need some people who can make judicious decisions, who have expertise in historical research or genealogy. But I did want to look and say, can we find anything that tells us anything about what happened
Mhm.
to these people, who we also want to lift up? Like, these are members of our parish,
Exactly.
and um, our brothers and sisters in Christ and members of this parish. And so I did find um, one thing that I wanted to share. Um, it is Union Army records, uh, descriptive lists of colored volunteer Army soldiers. It's from October of 1864. I found uh, two people who were on our baptismal records, who enlisted in the 11th of October, 1864. And um, so far, I think this is the only record that I think I'm reasonably confident enough to share with the parish of, okay, so this is what happened um, to at least two of our members. Here's just a, kind of a follow up. You can see, make it a little bit bigger. Here's the enlistment record. Uh, you come down here, you've got some people from
I see Woodford, yeah.
Woodford County. Uh, and then you have here um, Frank Johnson, William
Mhm.
Johnson. Uh, those names match the names in our baptismal record. Um, they are both indicated even as late as 1864 uh, in the records of African American soldiers enlisting in the Union Army. They include names of owners. That was a shock to me, that as late as 1864, uh,
Right.
African American soldiers who were enlisting from Kentucky were still uh, still listing names of owners. And then there's also, uh, you know, where to sort of assign them in terms of county. And
Mhm.
you can see here we've got Frank Johnson, William Johnson, both of whom are uh, listed as owned by Sarah F. Gaines uh, from Woodford County. So this tells
Mhm.
us a couple of things. I think one, it tells us, that Frank and William were alive 11 years later after their baptism, or 10 years later after their baptism, that they both served in the Union Army. That makes them not only members of the St. John's, but also veterans of
Right.
St. John's.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
and that I think this is a reasonable record given this information here that shows that the people included in our baptismal record really were enslaved persons. The record uses colored persons, uses the word belonged. We've
Right.
thought all along that that was a euphemism. I think now we rest pretty comfortably in the conclusion that everyone listed in that baptismal record is was enslaved, um, and owned by Sarah F. Gaines, uh, and and this also I think shows that
Does it show their age?
um, I don't believe it does. Um,
Okay, because in the baptismal records, it didn't show age either,
it
correct?
didn't
Just said
show
child.
age either.
Okay.
So it showed Frank at that time as an adult and William at that time as a child, but of course, 10 years later, you
Hmm.
know, they could both still be in the right age for military service. I mean, at the Civil War, that was
Certainly.
a
Hmm.
uh, pretty wide age range for soldiers. Um,
Well, something that I think is interesting that I just learned about today, of all things, and it was on a Facebook post, and you may have seen it from one of our members, that at Camp Nelson, they are going to be doing like a lighted memory walk in honor of soldiers' families at Camp Nelson who, and I may say it a little bit off of what it specifically said because I'm just going from memory, but regardless, when a soldier would go enlist at Camp Nelson, it sounds like their family was not welcome.
yeah,
And in this case, there were 4 expulsions, it sounds like, of family members from Camp Nelson. And one of them was during a terrible winter where 400 people were expelled. So this is women and children. Over, I think 102 died from the elements from exposure. So I was curious, do our 2 baptized members, did they have family? Did family go with them to Camp Nelson? I wonder what happened to them if that's the case.
yeah. And what a horrible thing to think about that. I mean, to be in the military, to be kind of under that authority, to be putting your life on the line for a cause that I assume most of the enlisted African Americans believed in, but then to be
Mhm.
treated so horribly as, you
Right.
know, your family
Your family meant nothing and they were forcibly
expelled,
sent away.
and then you don't know what became of them, and to have so many people die. I mean, like I think this is what, when it comes to history, this is the reason why we study these things, because
Mhm.
it's one thing to say, oh well, there was slavery back in the day, and but these stories are still with us, and they're still important stories for us, to know and to learn about, and to really realize that it wasn't just one thing that all of a sudden miraculously ended on one day and then everyone moved
Right.
on, right? Like it was, these are decades upon decades, century upon century of racial injustice in our
Right.
country, and all too often it's been ignored, it's been derided, it's been minimized, and um and if we're going to really be about the work of reconciliation, about healing, about pursuing justice, then I think we have to humbly walk into these stories and be a community where they could honestly be told without the kind of reactivity that so often accompanies whenever I think African Americans start speaking the truth about their experience. There tends to
Right.
be pretty hard and harsh reactivity to that. So, um, and we've had a little bit of that, I think, from the conversations. I've been impressed overall with the parish and how they've responded to this investigation, but I still think we've got some work to do. Um, and
I do too. I wonder if, another few over time sacred ground groups, maybe there's people who are ready to learn a little bit more of the big picture, say, okay, we're looking into our church history, but what is the huge picture, and then I think I think from knowing that a lot of people who have gone through the sacred ground were definitely more receptive and understanding that this history, the local church history, really does need to be looked at. So, that might be a good option for people who are, just getting their feet wet, just kind of understanding, oh, there's a lot more here than I realized. Where could I start? I think more sacred ground undertakings might be
right.
a good path for that.
Well, I think also I think back to one of the events I was at with Pastor Larry, and he invoked sort of Paul's line, I'm going to give you milk because you're not ready for meat.
Right. I remember. Yeah, I remember hearing stuff like that.
And I think that's a good reminder for us, like when we live in our obliviousness, and I acknowledge that
Oh
too.
yeah, yeah. Me too.
Part of it is because we haven't yet established ourselves as people who are safe and receptive and have done the advanced work to hear the real meat of the issue, the particularly, I mean, even of contemporary racism or racism within recent decades. And I've heard some reflections being shared just one on one privately with me, and some conversations I've had with people. Like there's more lingering under the surface than we want to talk about. There are people in our community, there are people in our parish who live through integration, both in the community, both African American and white. In our parish, white for the most part, um, and the differing experiences of that. And we don't often really talk about what integration looked like in Kentucky. What did it look like in Woodford County? But there are people who are still walking around with lived experience, with real memories of segregation. And
Hmm.
that so often, you know, just goes unacknowledged, right?
Right. It's not. Yeah, it's not spoken about.
It's not spoken about, and I think that's part of the reason why it's like we don't want to open the door to talking about slavery, because then we have to talk about, the post-war era, and then we have to talk about Jim Crow, and then we have to talk about the civil rights movement, and then we have to talk about today. And at each step, um, we have to acknowledge some hard truths about how we as a community responded, both
Right.
the good and the bad, both
Right. I mean, and
stand
I think we tend to owe all the bad, but hopefully there's great ways that we
right.
responded as well, and we can lift that up. And you know, but yeah, it's not to focus on the negativity. It's just to tell the truth.
It's to tell the truth, right? And
Mm.
and uh, and the
Well,
whole
and I was just going to say, in becoming beloved community,
right.
because we're not there. We're still not there.
Well, and I also want to say, like, to me, I like to do commemoration, historical work, memorials. I think that work tends to go better when it's addition, not subtraction. Like, I think it's important for us to realize that our nave commemorates and memorializes a number of people very prominently who were slaveholders. I mean, that's just a fact. I don't. They weren't only slaveholders. I think we can acknowledge the fact that without their faith and the work that they did, there would be no St. John's.
Right.
Um, no one is only one thing. Um, But to me, I think what would it mean if we got to a point as a community where we were willing to put up um, a plaque to honor, the enslaved members of the congregation that we have in our own records, and to say,
Right.
these people, these members, these sisters and brothers, um, had full, rich lives, were fully human, did things that mattered, contributed to the development of this community and this congregation, sacrificed more than they should have
Hmm.
been ever asked to, were denied dignity in their own lives, but can be commemorated now for their inherent dignity as children of God. Um, that's really, how do we add to our story rather than
Right.
subtract from it? Um, how do we add to our legacy and diversify our legacy versus how do we kind of let's let's just not talk about this.
Right. Yeah. The not talking is not healthy.
Right. um but I think this is work that's going to be done on a communal level, right? um and so I feel pretty good about where we're stopping, as good as I think I could. We found a lot.
Yeah.
We asked a question about our parish, and we've got some preliminary answers. There's
Mhm.
obviously a lot more work to do, but I think for this part of our 175th commemoration, I think it's been done well, and we were willing to look at something that was, I think, a little deeper than in
Mhm.
past commemorations. And my prayer is, by the 200th anniversary, more work, more documentation, a richer and fuller story of the parish history will be able to be told because we
Certainly.
we started this now.
Mhm. I agree.
Do you have any
I
other?
will just say too, a lot of the information was found much quicker than I ever thought it would. I
Yeah,
thought I thought it would take a long time to delve into, just a bit of people's histories. And when Ian came back with all of that info, I was like, oh. So that I think just pushed things along faster. But I think it was a blessing. It was, you know, if it took forever to find it, then I think we wouldn't have been able to acknowledge what of course, we couldn't have acknowledged what we are acknowledging now in our baptismal records of who we found and what we know of some of our original founding members. But I'm just me personally, I'm glad that it moved along a lot quicker than I had envisioned.
right.
So,
And I think there's any number of things that I just out of personal interest would love to see uncovered. Sort of, can we find more building records for
mhm,
the church? I've long suspected that the current building was built on the original foundation. I don't have any concrete evidence of that, but when you look at the dimensions of it, they don't match. One is smaller than the other. The footprint underneath the church is smaller than the church that's built on top, and that suggests to me, at least, that it was the original foundation, that a new church was built on the original foundation. You know, does that mean that the current church is resting on a foundation that was built, by enslaved people? That would be, and
sure.
I don't know the answer to that. That would be a fruitful area of historical research. I think greater genealogical work on um, on our members who we know were enslaved. I think some greater historical work with our neighbors. Uh, you know, Neighboring congregations, and to see sort of how they handle their history, what historical records they have. Um, I think it would be a fascinating conversation to learn more from St. Paul's AME, what the history of their congregation is,
Mhm.
how that history is commemorated, who their founders were, um, and how the African American community in Versailles persevered and supported congregations. I think that would be a heroic and a very enlightening story for us to know. So there's a lot of this. The one thing I hope doesn't happen is that this just kind of gets buried, right? Oh,
Right,
well, yeah,
right.
yeah, we're
Yeah, because I mean, we could even have people look into like the history of the rectories and kind of when you
right.
showed last time where it looked like a servants' quarters, were part of the, layout of the building plan, if I recall correctly, and to find out who were the servants, what became of them. I mean, if they were serving the priest, that was a big portion of the priest's life, and of course how involved they were, and you know just just to know more about them. I think that would be interesting. I think it would also be interesting to know about the wills of a lot of the founding members,
Yeah,
because I know that what you had found in one of the others, a large amount was given to the church. And we wonder about that. And, obviously records are not perfect if there was question about the death of, Sarah Gaines, and there was some confusion on there. So, I think if we could find the wills, and, was the church part of, were they getting, getting benefit from the sale of slaves, and wills, or I hope not, but with Mary Catherine's, findings, I have a feeling that would be kind of a usual happening. So, and again, I think that my goal with all this is to honor the peoples whose stories we're learning about,
right.
um, those enslaved stories. Um, uh, you know, I don't want to dishonor people who were slave owners. That is not my goal, but I think there's a lot to look into and understand, and to digest. And again, my big thing that I always kind of keep coming back to is, we hear slavery was a common thing, but yet how that was kind of woven into the religious ideas of it being normal, and that was what God expected, and that really bothers me because other people didn't see it that way. Other people saw there was a problem with it. So the church's teachings, that's one thing that really sits with me, that as a whole, a lot of the church was teaching that this was okay.
Well, and I also feel like, I mean, so much of that just feels evasive to me because it wasn't like abolitionists weren't active at this time. It wasn't like
Right, right.
there weren't other voices.
Hmm.
Someone 100 years from now could come back and say, well, climate change wasn't uncommon and was supported by many churches, and they
Hmm.
would be right. And so we just sit down today and say, well, climate change, climate denialism, right? Uh, is common and supported by various churches, and there are theological arguments made in support of it, and so that's normative, and we shouldn't ever.
Right. I don't like, yeah, like the normative is, yeah.
Yeah. And so, well, that was then, that's what people believed, right?
Hmm.
Like, what is it in our time that's
Right.
a common belief? that has been supported by religious community
Yeah, that we're gonna look there,
that
we won't look
people
back
are
on,
going
but others will look back
to
on.
back on? And do we
Mhm.
want them to just like give all of our contemporaries a pass, right? Like,
Right, right.
you know, vaccine skepticism. Well, that was normal, supported by all kinds of churches,
Mhm.
theological art. I mean, to me, that's kind of the same way it sounds to me whenever people say, well, you have to judge by the context of the time. Well, but Frederick Douglass was a contemporary of all of these people.
Mhm.
Judged by the context of the time, it,
Right.
it wasn't as if there weren't other people contemporaneously.
There were prophetic voices.
There were prophetic voices. The question then and the question now is, do you heed the prophetic
Mhm.
voices?
Right, right. Yeah,
Or- So, um,
hopefully so.
well, that's probably a good ending point for
Thanks.
us. I appreciate your partnership on this, and I know that uh, we've ended the last two with a prayer, and I think it's good to
Mhm.
end this one with one.
Sure. And I've got one from the Book of Common Prayer, and it is for the human family. And a lot of different organizations have used this for racism and truth telling, and it is just a good prayer for the human family. Oh God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time, all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Emily.
All right, thank you.